I took a quick look at Savant Ascent Remix and was quickly drawn in. I guess it's because of the art and gameplay, but it didn't take much for me to want to give it a try. I was happy with the fact that I was thrown right into the tutorial. I definitely do appreciate cutscenes and story beats in games, but sometimes I just want to dive in headfirst and learn as I go. I immediately thought that SAR offered great gameplay. At the same time, it's worth noting that it's simple and yet fun and challenging. Initially, I thought it was weird that you could only jump and roll around. I jotted down a note that it takes some getting used to because when compared to other games, the movement in SAR is a bit restricted. The point isn't to make it seem like this is bad, just that it approaches movement in a different way. Your character is definitely agile and able to pull off acrobatic moves, mainly depending on how good you are. Fast movement and dodging would eventually come into play once you started dealing with enemies. It didn't take long for me to realize that SAR has good enemy variety with different functions. I say that because some games pretty much just have one or two types of enemies, but with different skins/colors. Everyone has a different approach to how they handle their game's enemies, but I'll gladly take quality over quantity when it comes to enemies. Thankfully, SAR offers both. While fighting against enemies, I was happy to find out that they were capable of damaging each other. Not only was it helpful, I like that this was possible because in other games it seems that could/should be a possibility, but it isn't. Not only do I appreciate this because it makes things easier for me, but also because it requires you to think/play more strategically. There were times where rather than focusing on one enemy at a time, I'd aim towards taking out many by focusing on one, maybe two. That would then start a chain reaction. It was pretty much like killing two birds with one stone, but it also helped you earn more points, and you could last longer in whichever level you happen to be on. SAR has other ways of making things fair for you. It wasn't long before I noticed that a flying chest would occasionally start to be seen. The more I played, the more I realized that this occurred at specific moments, so I knew to keep an eye out for that. At first it was hectic trying to deal with enemies and wanting to take out this chest at the same time. I'd eventually realized that I was better off focusing on destroying the chest not only because it gave an additional heart, which was at times a lifesaver, but also because destroying it would kill all enemies around it or on screen. Some might feel that SAR doesn't offer much when it comes to bonus items or other power-ups, but I felt that it did enough with this. I quickly saw that SAR offers multiple difficulty settings. Not wanting to jump right into hardcore, I went with normal, which is pretty much what I always do anyway. It wasn't long before I noticed that normal occasionally felt very hard. I don't want to say that this is due to SAR being imbalanced, mainly because I do feel that the game is fair, but at the same time, normal was harder than I expected it'd be. Thankfully, checkpoints helped make things fairer. I eventually realized that I'd get a higher score if I played without relying on checkpoints, but at the same time, I was more interested in beating the game and not accumulating a large score for bragging rights. While SAR's checkpoint system was fair and helpful, I eventually realized that there were benefits to not relying on it. If you were to play a level straight from start to finish, you could at times end up with 4 or 5 hearts. That was a possibility as long as you avoided damage, so that wasn't something I regularly encountered. Still, I eventually realized that it was worth trying to make this happen because it'd be incredibly useful during boss fights. Since I heavily relied on the checkpoint system, I ended up having to start boss fights with 3 hearts instead of 4 or 5. Due to that, and also because of the difficulty, a lot of trial and error was necessary to figure out what worked best against bosses. It's not as if I could change what kind of weapon I had, mainly because so much of SAR is set in stone, but what I could do was change up my playstyle. I could dumb it down to the point where don't get hit is the best way to approach playing SAR, but there's way more to it besides that. In general, I felt that boss fights were like endurance tests requiring specific strategies. It's because sometimes there'd be bosses where no matter how much I'd attack them, their health bar wouldn't go down. It's possible that this was done on purpose, mainly to make the boss fights a bit more challenging, but it was for sure a hassle to deal with. Since I didn't know how to approach this, I died more times than I can count trying to figure out what I needed to do. Though the final boss in SAR was a bit more straightforward when compared to some of the other ones, it still wasn't easy because of the fact that it had 3 forms. Not only that, each form had specific details that needed to be figured out in order to overcome them. I don't know how much time it took me to eventually kill the final boss, but what I do know is that a lot of effort went into making this happen. Towards the end of my time with SAR, I realized that there were specific weaknesses or tells that made this boss fight a little easier. Even with that figured out, the fight was still hard because I was forced to deal with 3 different forms while only having 3 hearts. Despite combat, enemies, and bosses making up a large part of SAR, the same could be said of its art and music. At first, the art style reminded me of Castlevania. It's not just because it takes place in a dark fantasy styled setting, but also because of the music. I thought it was cool because it offered different moods. At times it managed to do a lot within a single track, and that stood out to me. For example, there was one that was upbeat and yet dark/regal. I liked that the music had a lot to offer because the truth is that SAR is a repetitive game. That may seem like a bad thing to some, but with how SAR plays out, it really isn't an issue. It was even to the point where I thought that a free play mode would be great. It could be endless like Tetris, where the point is to get as high of a score as you possibly can, or just survive as many waves of enemies as you can. I eventually found out that SAR does have a survival mode, but that'll be a part of the full release version. Since I had access to a version that was missing some features, that wasn't on my mind while I was playing. It's possible that having the survival mode part of the game would have made me spend more time with it, but I got enough enjoyment from it. Even though I greatly enjoyed SAR, I had some issues with it. What really bothered me was how long it took to load after you die. It took around 15 seconds to go from dying to being able to restart a level. I realized that 15 seconds may not seem like a long time, and bringing that up makes me seem too nitpicky, but when you multiply 15 seconds by the number of times I died, you can easily see why this bothered me. It's also because I like to think that if a game is hard and dying a lot is a byproduct of that, you want to be able to get back to playing as soon as possible. Some hard games I've played in the past realized that and were able to make it so that dying and restarting was near instantaneous. It's possible that it was like this because I was playing a copy meant for reviewers, but I hope this doesn't spill over into the full version of the game. SAR was a difficult game and there were a few things about it that bugged me, but overall, it's great. Simply put, I loved it. I pretty much spent a whole night playing it because I knew I was close to beating it. Like a few other games I've reviewed, it left me feeling hooked and I disregarded other things I needed to take care of. Towards the end of my all-nighter with SAR, I realized how I could dish out more damage against the final boss, something I already mentioned at an earlier point. I wanted to keep playing and beat the game when I saw that it was possible to use this against the boss, but the truth is that I was ready to throw in the towel. Around 20 minutes or so after I woke up, I ended up beating the boss and the game in general. I guess I had to sleep on what I'd learned to fully understand how to play against the boss. Bottom line, Savant Ascent Remix is an awesome game. Within a couple of play sessions, I quickly accumulated nearly 10 hours of playtime with it. That doesn't happen too often, so when it does, I take it as a sign that I'm really enjoying myself. As it stands, there's not much that could be done to improve the gameplay, but I do see the possibility of changing things up by adding different weapons, levels, power-ups, and enemies. At the end of the day, it depends on what the dev is planning on doing with Savant Ascent Remix, but the fact that even more could be done with it is a sign that this is indeed a great and open-ended game. How do you feel about games with limited control/mechanics? Are you the kind of player that gets fixated on specific parts of a game? What's the most amount of time you've dedicated to a game after a handful of play sessions? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share, and if you're up for it, become a patron. Thank you very much for watching.